Today, I'm going to be showing you guys how to make a 90s, early 2000s era emo rock sound. Something that's poppy, catchy, has a lot of guitar layers in it, but also kind of has that early Paramore grit to it. It's punchy, it's aggressive, and I figured I might as well plug my own band while I do it. The song I'm going to show you guys today is called Blue Eyes by Royal Rose, which I am a part of. I produced this track, and I'm really happy with the work that we did and how it turned out. So, shameless plug, but I also think we're going to talk about some stuff that's really helpful for just everybody. So let me just show you what it sounds like real quick.
Driving that I-5 is nothing compared to the rest of our lives, and I'm not scared that I love you and you love me too. And when dead my life can turn around, and I see you now looking at me with those blue eyes, blue eyes, blue eyes.
So yeah, a lot of fun layers going on. I used a pretty beefy mastering chain on the final song, and so I just have this temp mastering chain on here for now. I'll show you guys what's in it later, but yeah, it was a bit too heavy to run in one session with OBS. But yeah, let's start with the most vital part to a song in this style, in my opinion, which is the guitars, which this is what all of those guys sound like. So for all these guys, we just tracked them with my Jazz Master. I feel like P90s work really well for this sound, specifically like in the middle position, because you can kind of do the same thing as like a Stratocaster, where if you have the pickup selector in the middle position, you can get a really nice grit and crunch to it without it like buzzing too much. The way that I approach this in my mind is that our band is a very stripped band. It's a drummer, a bass player, and two guitar players, and one of the guitar players is a lead singer. And you run into some very interesting decisions when you're producing this style of music and you have limited musicians in the band, because there's a part of me that would love to just add like 15 layers of synthesizers and ear candy, but then the problem is we can't really play that live, and we are occasionally playing live shows, and so there's a sort of balance you have to fit with like how much production do we want to add to the song to make it cool without taking it outside of that sphere of this is a band. And so we stepped a little bit outside of that, having a couple of lead guitar layers stacked on top of each other, but for the most part, I feel like it's very true to like what we can kind of pull off live. So here's the lead guitar parts. So you can see what I'm talking about here. It's like technically this might be a part that you would split across two guitar players, but just having it feel a little bit more full. And so just having a little bit of a splash of melody on the sides just for that part keeps it a little bit interesting. Also, you can see I panned this one guitar off to the side a little bit because everything else that's like the main part is like kind of in the middle. And so it's a lot easier to get separation if you sort of duck it out of the way. For anybody who's curious on what we use for guitar tone, we're mainly using this Neural DSP Imperial Tone King, but you can kind of get this with any kind of Fender style amp, I feel like. I just like the way that this one's voiced the most. Most of it was tweaked from this like chewy lead preset. And as you can see, I'm really high passing these guys a bit more than I normally would, because with this style of music, so much of that punch comes from just like that low end smack. And so I feel like you really have to be intentional about removing that from other elements that don't need that smack. Like you don't need this like doo-dee-doo-dee-doo to have like this low end body to it. And it's a similar situation with the power chords here on the bottom. Like they have a grit to them, but it's not like they're super low and punchy the way you would expect them to be, because a lot of that's going to be coming from the kick and the bass. This guitar patch is actually one that I made. I call it American Honk Ball, but it's a compressor mixed with a Saldano and a dual rectifier, and then just sort of balancing the two of them. Also, quick side note, I'm currently working on some courses and some tone pack stuff for Guitar Rig and some other plugins. So if you're interested in that, check out the link in the description. description, or go to produceguitarpop.com and you can join the email list and you'll get updates for whenever stuff gets put out. So putting it on the overdrive channel, but then also turning the overdrive down a lot and really slamming it with the compressor. It gives it this really consistent tone that's consistently gritty instead of this thing you can run into without a compressor where it feels like the grittiness kind of like dynamically goes up and down depending on how hard you're picking, which is fine in some cases. But for me, I really wanted this like stereo guitar part that felt consistent the whole way through. And then the last guitar part that we have are these guys, which actually might be my Strat, if I'm remembering right, through this other preset that I made. Side A is a Soldano with a little bit of EQ on it. And then I'm not using any of these. And then side B is what looks like an AC30 with a little bit of like low end carving. So if I like go between these two amp sounds, you can hear, like, you can get like a gradient of like a really clean, sparkly tone that's pleasant and light to hear, and then something really distorted, and you can blend between the two of them. And I just added these guys because without them, the intro kind of felt a little bit too sparse. And then I just kind of ended up bringing them into every other section of the song because they just add a little bit of almost like a distorted pad vibe to it. So if I play the chorus, you'll hear what I'm talking about. I'll turn them off. I'll show you now what happens when I turn them on like a little bit into the chorus. And then turning them on. Turning them off. Turning them on. Like if I solo them, in the context of the track, it's actually kind of hard to hear them a little bit, but that was kind of the point. I didn't really want to make a layer that felt like another guitar part that we would give to like a hypothetical third guitar player. I wanted to make something that just kind of filled out the space a little bit more. And since these guys are sort of matching the rhythm of these like power chords, it just kind of feels like the power chords just like pop open a little bit more. In terms of mixing, I'm just doing some basic EQ shaping. Stock Ableton limiter, honestly, I feel like for stuff like this, just get things vaguely sounding how you want them to sound, and then just bring your ceiling down on a limiter until you start clipping off the top. Even just a little bit like that, and that will do a lot to like control the guitar layers that you have going on. And then I brought in some Pro Q3 just because I felt like in some of the lead parts they were kind of masking the vocals. So if I hit play here, you can see these like red sort of gradient things that pop up. So that's because I am side chaining this EQ to Sam's vocal, and it's analyzing where there's like frequency masking happening between this and this guitar. And so to make things a little bit easier, I just kind of ducked it out. Also, I know this looks extreme, but keep in mind my dB scaling is like 6 dB. So if we go to like the standard Pro Q, it's more like this. And then SPL Twin Tube, I feel like this is really helpful for getting stuff to pop out a little bit. It's like almost adding another distortion pedal onto your guitar tone without it sounding like you threw another guitar distortion pedal on it. Like, I'll show you what I mean. If I solo it and I turn it off, turning it on, 3, 2, 1. Turning it off. Turning it on. It just like kind of pops out a little bit more, but it doesn't feel like I'm like changing the guitar tone. To my ears, this just kind of takes that little guitar part like doo dee doo doo doo, and it makes it pop out of the mix. When I have it off, it's like barely audible at all. But yeah, then a little bit of track spacer on the guitar group. Sam has a really round vocal tone, and I feel like it just works better in this context to just have the guitars just kind of like dynamically duck out of the way of her vocal, because it's almost like a resonant frequency. Like, she's very clean when she sings because she has like proper vocal training, but because there's like less harmonics, I guess you would say, on her voice, you have to do a little bit of work to make sure that other elements are not taking up that space, which I never do vocals on my channel, so let's do vocals next. So here's what the vocals sound like.
Me too. And when did my life get turned around? And I see you now, looking at me with those blue eyes, blue eyes, blue eyes.
So I think we did multiple passes of these guys, but then I think I just threw them into a group and just processed them as if this is like one big fat track. In case you guys are wondering about the effects, we have some Valhalla vintage verb plate. Some concert hall. It's really subtle, but it's like an ambient reverb for this style, and I felt like it worked a little bit better than ROM verb. Valhalla delay. And then just a standard slap delay. So this is what the vocals sound like without effects.
Those blue eyes, blue eyes, blue eyes.
So we have one main vocal, stereo doubles left and right for Sam's doubles, and then stereo left and right harmonies for the whole song. For the mic, I just used my Slate ML1. It's actually a pretty versatile mic, even if you're not using the mic recreation features on it. It still works really well. It's just like a really good, solid mic. Real quick, I'll just go through my vocal chain, one plugin at a time. So first thing is this Pro Q3.
And you don't even try, lost in a current.
So for me, one of the most important things at the beginning of a vocal chain is deciding where the high pass filter starts, and that's just something that I feel like you've got to tweak per singer. I like starting it at around 170, but basically you want to tame your low end as much as you can going into your vocal chain, because if you don't tame it, what ends up happening is anytime there's like a low end build up from like somebody pushing their vocal a little bit harder, or if they have a bit more of a rounder tone, all that stuff is going to be really triggering the compression personally in a way I don't like it. And so I have just a regular high pass and then a couple of dynamic bands that I'll normally like solo based off of the vocal and like search for those like resonant areas that might pop out a little bit too much. So like a nasally style frequency, and then more of like a throaty resonant frequency. Also similar to things before, this is on 3 dB scaling, so if you just have regular Pro Q, it's going to look more like this. It's very subtle. And then we're going into an LA3A, which in my personal opinion is way more usable than an LA2A. I feel like you can get a little bit more aggressive with it and it still sounds really clean for an optical compressor.
Thought you were different, and you don't even try, lost in a current of God's faithful design.
And then we're going into some virtual mix rack with a channel strip, some de-essing, some Neve EQ, and a distressor.
Thought you were different, and you don't even try, lost in a current.
So I normally use a distressor on vocals, but this song specifically, it was really important because, like I said, Sam has a bit more of a rounder tone. And so you have to use something that has a little bit more distortion on it to get to pop out a little bit more. Another de-esser.
Thought you were different, and you don't even try, lost in a current.
A little bit more compression with RVox.
Thought you were different, and you don't even try.
Some resonant frequency taming just to keep the overcompression from sounding a little too muddy.
Thought you were different, and you don't even try, lost in a current.
And then even more distortion to like make Sam's vocal pop out a little bit more.
Thought you were different, and you don't even try, lost in a current.
And then some micro shift.
Thought you were different.
Just to bring a little bit of stereo wideness on the sides. And that's basically what I did for all the other vocals as well. And then we will look at our bass, which sounds like this.
Thought you were different, and you don't even try, lost in a current. Thought you were different, and you don't even try, lost in a current.
And then we will look at our bass, which sounds like this. which I wanted to get a really gritty, like punk bass tone that also went super low. So I used punk bass by Submission Audio, going into the Fat Clean preset on Parallax by Neural DSP. Did quite a bit of tone shaping to try to keep it from being too bright. I didn't want it to be like a modern, like punk bass sound. I wanted it to be more of a modernized version of like an old punk bass sound, if that makes sense. And then a little bit of Bark of Dog, which is just like a free low end enhancer. So without it. Then turn it on. Just makes it a lot beefier, but also I think if you're going to use stuff like this, it is also helpful to have like a frequency to key analyzer, because setting this frequency at like what the key of the song is really helps. And then the last thing we have to talk about are the drums, which sound like this. So here, let me turn off the bus. If I turn on the kick is from Aggressive Rock, One Hit Wonder. I wanted the drums to be really spitty and punky and in your face, but also kind of indulge in that like over compressed punk sound. I did use a little bit of Transient Master to pull down the sustain, because I feel like this kick drum works really well when it's just like really spitty, and then a little bit of max bass to make it a little bit. So if I turn off those guys, it sounds like this. If I turn it on, you can hear it just kind of turns it into like a little, that still has a lot of beef to it. And then I layered up a kick sample. I normally am not a fan of layering up samples on the kick most of the time, if I'm being honest. I feel like they just have a tendency to cause phase issues, but I felt like it needed a little bit more of a sample-y vibe, and so I threw one of these Taylor Larson samples underneath it. We also have this Taylor Larson sample on the snare. And then these look like they're empty tracks, but it's just audio from One Hit Wonder being routed out of the mixer, because you can actually go to the mixer here and route them onto different stereo outputs out of Contact. And then if you bring them into a separate audio channel where you select that instance of the track, you can select a different output from Contact to just come out on this track. So this is the snare, some SPL, some EQ, just to make things a little bit heavier and a little bit more cleaner. I don't think I did anything to the toms. And then the overhead sound like this. When I'm processing an overheads track, I'm really just trying to get it to sound clean and nice and even. Like, it should be like a smooth high end that you can then bring up into like the kick and snare that you already have going. Also used a little bit of FET compression. A lot of FET compression. And then I just kind of tuned the room mic to be a little more scooped sounding if I turn that off. I just wanted it to get more of a brighter reverb vibe. Honestly, when you're viewing a room mic in this context, you just want to treat the room mic as if it is like a reverb send and just dial it to sound like the kind of reverb you want, mainly for the snare drum. So altogether, those drums without the bus sound like this. Which has a lot of the broad stroke stuff that I'm looking for, but it also is kind of lacking some of like the definition on the cymbal stuff, which again, we're kind of like getting into like a pick and choose your battles thing where it's like, okay, yes, I want to hear the cymbals, but I also don't want things to be like too loud. I want to hear like the small dynamics of stuff, but I also want this like slammed drum sound. So it's like a balancing act you constantly have to weigh out. I use FET compression. A little bit of G-clip. Mainly to get the snare. Some parallel compression on a VCA. This is to kind of just bring up a lot of the really aggressive drum sound that you want to have in a track like this. Like if I turn it up all the way. Like there's a stupid level of aggressiveness that brings out, but that's kind of too much. So you just bring the mix knob down a little bit. And then a virtual tape machine. This kind of adds some saturation, but it also kind of adds this EQ curve to the drum sound. Like if I turn it off. And then I think on like the last stage of mixing, I just threw this on like at 1%. I think I just wanted a little bit more brightness and bite out of it all. But yeah, that's what the mix sounds like. I cannot show you my mastering chain in real time because this is kind of a beefier session, but I can show you what's in it and what is in the final song. A couple of really light instances of soothe just to tame any random resonant frequencies that come through a little bit too much. And EQ, again, setting your EQ scaling is really important because you can make like moves that are really dialed in like this without just instinctively being like, oh, well, that's not enough. I didn't move it that far. Also, when you're about to render out a master, make sure to set your EQ to linear phase mode because that will keep any weird phase stuff from happening with like high pass filters. Some virtual bus compression on the glue high pass setting. I feel like high pass setting is what you want to use when you want the whole mix to kind of like duck under the snare, like so that's normally how I'm using it. I think I might have turned it off for this section because I think just before the render, I think I liked it triggering off of the kick a little bit more. So, but that's if you're ever curious about why you would use a high pass version of a patch on a bus compressor versus just like the regular version, that's why. A clipper, I don't use a clipper the way that a lot of rock guys do. I know some people like to use a clipper instead of a limiter. What I do is I just throw it on to get the sort of distortion off of like a kick and a snare while taming those peaks, because then I can take the whole mix and then boost it into the mastering limiter a lot more, and I can bring stuff up while still keeping that aggressive side. Tonalized gentle preset in Leapwing Dyne 1. This is a multi-band compressor where you can just kind of bring up like a parallel multi-band compression signal. Basically, long story short, it's a way to get a little bit of extra loudness without like squashing anything. You can take a lot of the lower stuff and sort of bring it up a little bit. So something like this is great if you want to get a little bit more loudness, like a little bit more, but you're kind of at a point where you can't really boost it into the limiter anymore. A little bit of max bass, I just felt like it was necessary. Some more virtual tape machine. And then before the limiter, if I have a song that I know I'm trying to match, I will use this. This is Ozone Match EQ. So what you can do is you can play a reference track and capture the EQ curve of that reference track. And then you can play your own mix and capture your own EQ curve that you have right now. And you can use this slider to sort of change the EQ curve that you have on your track to fit that reference track a little bit better. So if you have a song that is a similar style of the song that you're making and you want to sort of like compare what your mix looks like to their mix, this can be a really helpful tool. I ended up leaving like a good like 10% EQ curve change, but if you like zoom in, that ends up being like half a dB of low end boost at 60, a third of a dB boost around 6K, and like some very, very minor cuts. Like it was a very soft adjustment, and I think that was mainly because I picked a reference song that I felt was really close to what we already had, so I knew that we would be able to get pretty close to it. And then we have limiter, Pro L2, just kind of running it as basic as you can. I believe the end master ended up being -8 short-term LUFS, if you're curious, around the chorus. By the time I get to my master limiter, I only like it doing like a few dB of gain reduction, because if you can do all of like your loudness management with clipping and compression and upwards compression and all that stuff, like if you can like prep it to go into the limiter, then the limiter doesn't really have to do that much to bring like the overall loudness up. But yeah, real quick again, this is what the song sounds like.
And when did my life could turn around, and I see you now, looking at me with those blue eyes, blue eyes, blue eyes.
So yeah, I hope you guys found that helpful. If you like this kind of content, hit subscribe, like, comment, all that stuff. Again, I'm working on some stuff like courses and tone packs, so if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you can join the email list below or go to produceguitarpop.com. I also have a Discord where we're doing some fun stuff every once in a while, so you feel free to join that. Yeah, I will see you guys next week.